So that sort of, I don't know, it kind of jarred me into thinking, like, what else am I missing about a place like Beckley, West Virginia? Like who else am I missing in a place like Beckley? Who have I missed? Who have I not seen? And I don't know, it just made me rethink a lot. And it made me think that maybe there's a lot more to what's great about the American people than even we realize.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf and Marlo Slayback.
And today we're joined by Miles Smith, who is a professor of history at Hillsdale College, and we're actually going to let him introduce himself. So Miles, welcome to Conservative Conversations. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Marlo. I'm Miles Smith. I'm assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College. I teach mainly U.S. history in the 19th century. I also do Latin America every once in a while, so I keep it pretty hemispheric on this side of the Atlantic. I'm from North Carolina originally, so it's snowy outside in Michigan where I live, and so I'm sort of getting back into the realization that I live in a winter wonderland. Or as I kind of joke with my students, depending on my mood, I either feel like I'm in Russia or Narnia. I teach history. I love Hillsdale. I sort of got introduced to ISI via Hillsdale, so I didn't really know the ISI world until I got here, and so it's definitely enriched my scholarship and my intellectual life quite a bit. So it's great to be talking with you guys this morning.
Awesome. And Miles will be a professor at our upcoming honors conference. So let this serve as a quick plug to any undergraduate students who could potentially come to our honors conference, which is our week-long premier summit for our top undergraduates. And you'll hear from great professors like Miles Smith and many others, including some of Miles's colleagues at Hillsdale. And it's an all-expenses-paid week out in our new Linda Bean Conference Center at our headquarters in Wilmington. And we have a great week for our students planned. You can go to isi.org/events and find our honors conference and submit your application, which is due on February 4th. And before we get to our conversation, I'd like to thank the listener, undergraduate student, graduate student, or beyond, for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help us fulfill our mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. And now, the other thing we have to do before we really begin our conversation is we're bringing back the listener question segment, which is something that we used to do long ago, and we're bringing it back. And so our first listener question comes from one of our social media followers, and he asks, what are some good books for getting kids into classic texts or the Western tradition? So Miles, let's start with you, and then Marla, I want to hear about yourself as well, what you think.
Yeah, my answer is a little prosaic. I don't think it's particularly profound. I mean, for me it was literature actually that got me into the Western tradition much more than history. My mom was a big devotee of George MacDonald, and the fantasy stories of George MacDonald, I think, were kind of me a window into. I'm from a pretty normal guy from central North Carolina. There's a lot of great stuff about it, but you don't necessarily walk out your door in a textile town and be like, how am I connected to, right, everyone else? How am I connected to a tradition that goes back further than the American Revolution, further than the immediate ideas I would think about day to day? And so for me, it was stories like The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, these fantasy stories that got me sort of thinking about the human story in a paradigm that was not immediately my own. And those sort of drove me to read more books, and and a lot of those were fiction. And those fiction titles, I think, sort of got me asked about the authors. And so I became interested in the Western tradition really via biography of the fiction writers I read, guys, Tolstoy's biography, Dostoevsky's biography, C.S. Lewis's biography. And so that was my entrance into, I wish I could say that I had read something really profound, like a big collection. Like my colleague Richard Gamble has The Great Tradition, which I think was published with ISI. Those things are incredible. I didn't have access to them, and it wasn't really on my completely normie con family's radar screen. And so it was fiction and biography of writers that really got me interested in what you can call the Great Tradition.
Yeah, I would be interested in your response to what I'm about to say, Miles, and Tom too, because I know you're interested in biographies and the founding. This is something I've been thinking a lot about with a son who I want to, cultivate the virtues of, things like heroism and sacrifice. And so I've been thinking a lot about how literature shapes that, that knowledge of those virtues early on, especially when kids are, as someone who loathes Harry Potter, I think there's ways to implement or include, fantasy and some of these, the fantastical elements that might spark a child's imagination, whether they're, my he's a toddler, so he can't read yet, but it's something that I'm thinking about even further down the line once kids are, hopefully voracious readers that are reading everything in sight. I'm also of the opinion that not all books are good. There are some books that are very bad. And so, it's a parent's responsibility to make sure that the books that their child is reading are edifying and are in some way creating an imagination and a character that is hopefully, able to create a virtuous personality for that child down the road. So even things like The Little Prince, I don't know if the asker, specifically has a teenager or a child, but I'm a huge fan of some of these classics that you can start your children on very early on in life. The Little Prince, Beatrix Potter books, beautiful illustrations that those matter. I think illustrations that are really beautiful and, oftentimes watercolor, those create a taste for high culture early on. Aesop's Fables. You mentioned C.S. Lewis, Miles. I also think for young boys, so I have a son, and something that's really important to me is getting, even if they're renditions of longer biographies, but just books that are able to describe some of the virtues of great leadership and of men of history who have been great leaders. So that can include, anyone from George Washington to, perhaps in my case, I've been reading a biography on Blessed Karl of Austria. So that's someone that I would love to expose my son to once he's old enough. And hopefully if there's a book for kids that could sum up that book, I would love to expose that to him. So I don't know if maybe Tom, you have some examples of people that you think, young boys especially, but also for young girls, just some books that I think are great, like Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie, I think is a good one. And I mention Lord of the Rings, I think is good for boys and girls. Yeah, those are just some of my some of examples that I could think of. What about you, Tom? Do you have any? I'd be interested also in Tom and Miles' examples that you might have of great, men and women of history that you think children should start reading once they're able to pick up a book.
I know myself, I didn't really get into the sort of Western tradition until high school. And that's when I started reading things like the Odyssey and the Iliad and, Machiavelli and intellectual works, and started to carve out or start to dive into the Western intellectual tradition. But I don't really remember doing that. Maybe in 7th and 8th grade, I took an interest in American history and the American founding and the Constitution and the Revolutionary War. So people like the Marquis de Lafayette or George Washington, of course, and the Adams and Jefferson. But growing up, the only thing I can really remember besides I loved mystery stories, I loved the Hardy Boys, and my sister had Nancy Drew. Those are very fun if you're into the sort of mystery angle, which I really am. But I've never even read The Lord of the Rings. That's on my short list to read this year, and The Hobbit. So for the one thing that I really do remember reading was my mom got me an illustrated child's Bible. And so it was getting myself interested in the sacred texts, but not really reading them as sacred texts, more literature. And I can't think of a better moral story, or like a story that tells a lesson than, the beginning stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and Abraham, like these great people who are fallen, but there's redemption, and you should, do things that are just and pleasing to God. These are important stories. And then if you find I know there are much better the ones than even the one I had, but if you find these good illustrated children's Bibles, I think that's something good, and that's something from my own childhood that I really actually remember. I'll probably do some other things differently, like the Lord of the Rings, Narnia, but that's for me. Miles, to go back to Marlo's question, what are some of the great men and women of history that you recommend as a historian for cultivating the imagination of kids?
Well, for me, I mean, I told you guys I was from the South, and this is kind of a bigger conversation we may get into. I'm my hometown is about 40,000 people. It wasn't a big city. I didn't grow up in a suburb, and so it was still a pretty southern place. And my grandfather was born in 1927, and so grew up in a world where a lot of the literary heroes that he encountered and that people his age would have encountered in the South were Southern figures. And so the first real serious biography I ever read was by Clifford Doughty. And Clifford Doughty was one of the guys who they call the Richmond Patricians. There's these three authors, Clifford Doughty, Robert Self Henry, and Douglas Southall Freeman. And they mainly wrote biographies of Confederate figures, not exclusively Confederate figures, but Confederate figures usually. And so the first real big people biography I read was Clifford Doughty's biography of Robert E. Lee. And we live in this world that's very different, even the one I grew up in the 90s. And so the first man I remember thinking I wanted to emulate was Robert E. Lee. And a lot of people would sort of say, have you changed your mind on that? Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I'm more aware of Robert E. Lee's foibles. Yeah, he was a slave owner. Was he perfectly great to his slave? No. I mean, I don't think that any slave owner is ever just great to their slaves, right? So I don't want to live in a world where I kind of have a cupcakes and unicorns vision of chattel slavery. Having said that, like, there's just something very basic about this man who has some sort of classical idea of virtue that he lived that I think is still worth emulating. And so that was as far as virtue literature, if you grew up in the South in the 80s or 90s, the virtue literature you were going to get, especially via biography, was going to be about Southern coded figures. And so and I don't regret that, really. I mean, I think that was really important for me, to think of a man who, okay, this is a guy who had the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and Marcus Aurelius' Meditations on his nightstand at all time. Even just that sort of thing as a high schooler made me want to read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Made me want to take my faith, which I'm Anglican, so made me want to take my faith more seriously. And so that virtue literature via the form of biography of someone like Robert E. Lee, and you could get it from someone like George Washington as well, was really important for me, especially as a boy, because it was male coded in an important way. And I think that's something worth reclaiming. It's worth guys reading biographies of guys and learning how to be a guy. Like, if someone's in high school listening to this, like, if you're going to be a guy, it was better for me to learn that from Robert E. Lee than from Andrew Tate. And that a lot of people would hear that and they'd be like, well, is that a moral equivalency? No, I think Robert E. Lee was a Christian man. I think he was a man who was virtuous in a lot of ways. So yeah, if you put Robert E. Lee on a table by Andrew Tate, I want kids reading biographies of Robert E. Lee. And I think that sounds seditious to our modern ear because we're so clued in on questions of slavery. And those are important things. And I'm pretty willing to say that the Confederacy wasn't necessarily a historical proposition that people should have fought for. By the same token, you're not going to convince me that Robert E. Lee isn't someone who was good for me to have, isn't not someone that was good for me to have read.
So that's a great transition to, I think, a question that we'll be talking about throughout this podcast and this podcast recording, which is, I think, drawn from a recent event, which was the National Park Service in Pennsylvania retracting plans to remove a William Penn statue from historic Philadelphia. And it met with lots of backlash. I mean, if you're on Twitter, that's where I was mostly following this. It was like, this is insanity. Like, it's one thing a few months ago, and this has been kind of a trend to remove like a Robert E. Lee statue from Virginia, but it's another to remove, this British Quaker that did not have the background that Lee did. And so it almost seems to take on this arbitrary, almost vindictive in a sense tone that these statues of people who, were great men of history that perhaps, obviously had their sins to some degree, but the William Penn statue one was quite inexplicable, I think. So what would you say this is a twofold question, the role of statues in the first place? Like, what do they represent in the mythology of places like the South, but also in colonial America, or what was colonial America, and how these statues represent American history, and for its, with its faults, and with the Penn statue, if you can give us any background you can on why this particularly was insane, and what you think this larger trend has represented over the years.
Yeah. So I'll do the first part first about statues, and maybe talk about what they mean in a place like my hometown. So I think one of the things that's interesting is most towns don't have statues of a general. They have a statue of a soldier, typically an unnamed common soldier. And that was the case from my hometown, which is Salisbury, North Carolina. And in a block off the town square, you can see it from the square, was a statue. It was a gorgeous statue, really quite moving statue, of a fallen Confederate soldier who was being held by a figure I always thought was an angel. It wasn't an angel, actually. It was a fate, and it was an artistic representation of a fate, and that was basically a slumped Confederate soldier with what looked like an angel holding him. And so I don't think I thought a lot about the Confederacy when I saw that statue. I thought a lot about the fact that that's the guy who had died in battle when I saw that statue. So to me, I wasn't so much thinking about the cause. I was thinking about the virtues of the soldier himself. And it was really powerful. Young boy, you don't really think a lot about death. And every time, my grandparents lived in kind of a historic home right off the town square. And so guess what? I spent a lot of days, I lived a mile away from my grandparents. And so you would see that statue, and, you talk to your parents, and you talk to your grandparents. And so those statues, I think, created conversations about what really quite old virtues look like, the martial valor, sacrifice, giving our lives for someone. No one sat around and was like, well, let's have a deep dive into the socio-political dynamics of 1860s South to talk about this statue here. No, you're talking about very human things. And so that's what that statue served as in my community. Yeah, I don't know, there's a book called Confederates in the Attic. And it's a book written by the late Tony Horowitz about sort of Confederate member, but he was thinking a lot more about the Confederacy when he traveled to my hometown to talk about, to look at it, than I ever was. And so I don't think of those statues as necessarily even representative of the Confederacy. I thought of it as representing the fact that there were men from my home county who had died in battle. And so it was a lot more about them and the fact that they had died, really sacrificing their lives for something, than what that particular sacrifice had even been for. So, it was the statues, at least in my context, were not really, even though they were of Confederate soldiers, the Confederacy was sort of accidental to the statue. That wasn't the case everywhere, I'm sure, but that was the case, I think, in quite a few places where you'd have a common soldier represented. The second part is like the William Penn statue. I think I was incensed by it. I was really angry by it, because if there's one guy who you want to use to kind of, if you're going to paint, the president had gone to Valley Forge that same week and said, hey, this is an election about democracy. Well, if you're going to make the sort of sum total of American political life a defense of liberal democracy, there's no better sort of origin point for that than William Penn. I mean, he's the guy who creates the show about what maybe you can call the best of the progressive tradition. Starts with this British, like you said, Marlo, this British Quaker. I mean, like, if you're looking for the most progressive guy in the late 18th century, you can't do much better than William Penn. And so the question is, what's the point about Penn? What's wrong with him? What's the reason offered? And the reason offered was that, well, we want to make a more inclusive space. Okay, fine. Add a statue of a Lenape Indian. Add a statue of Tamanin, the Lenape chief. But getting rid of William Penn just seems arbitrary, but my conspiratorial side says there's something worse at work. And I will say the governor of Pennsylvania, the Democrat governor of Pennsylvania, was also against the removal of Penn statue. And so I don't think this was a partisan decision. I think it was an ideological one. And so I think even a lot of guys who were probably more on the left than me in Pennsylvania were like, hey, what's up? There's no reason they could find to get rid of William Penn. And so, which seems completely fair question to ask to me.
Yeah, I'd have to hear more about what you think the end game of all of this is, because something that I remember, this was in Charlottesville, was a really challenging day because there's a lot of violence. But one of the original sort of impetuses for this was protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I remember when President Trump was being asked about this, and he was getting media flack for it, he was saying, well, what are we going to do next? Like, Robert E. Lee was a slaveholder. That was bad. We can condemn that. But, like, what's next? Washington? Jefferson? Like, we don't have a country without George Washington. And Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. He gives, in some sense, a definition or the meaning of America, I guess, depending on what persuasion you think of or how you read the American founding. On some readings, like, Jefferson is the spiritual, intellectual father, and Washington is the figure who brings it all into being. So, like, are we going to get rid of those statues? And I think that is the goal. Even Abraham Lincoln statues are being desecrated. I'm from Massachusetts, in Boston. During 2020, they ripped down the Christopher Columbus statue. But I would love to hear what you think the end game of all of this is and where this all leads. And then maybe afterwards we could talk about how we should fight back, or how much sort of give and take we have to have on this.
Yeah, I don't know what the end game is. I mean, I think that my major concern is that there's actually a reflexive anti-Americanism in certain cores of the left, to the point that anything that has any root in America before, I don't know what the hell, like 2008, is somehow bad. And I think it's because I think it comes from a disposition that people really don't like the United States. And I know that sounds reductionistic, but they just don't like the U.S. And I think you see there's certain quarters of the right where you see this too. I just think it's much more prominent on the left. Like, you have people who just really don't like America. And I don't even think it's because they're necessarily iconoclast. They just can't find anything valuable about it. And I think that's because even conservatives, we haven't done a good job of finding of showing what's valuable about the U.S. I'll give you just one example. I live in a small town in the Midwest, a much smaller town than one I grew up in, and it's a Rust Belt town, and the economy's hollowed out, and so there's not a lot of way in economic hope for the folks, especially the local folks, and a lot of them are really nice people, but like if you talk to someone here, if you talk to a person between 15 and 25 here, their dream is not to stay in this town and make it better. Their dream is to go to LA or Miami or Washington, D.C. or XXXXX, place they've seen on TV. And so what conservatives have done is, I think, not actually push back on the reality of the problem, which is a lot of people, especially a bit younger than I am, think there's only about 4 places that are worth living. And those 4 places, it's not even about cities, right? Cincinnati, no one wants to move to Cincinnati. No one wants to move to Pittsburgh, which are great, great towns. Everybody wants to go to one of these ones they've seen on TV. So life is really worth it if you live in Los Angeles or Miami or maybe New York City and you live on a beach or something like that. And so we've done a bad job of actually saying, like the very simple, mundane parts of American life are actually completely beautiful. And I tell my students, I call it hot dog nationalism. I'm from North Carolina, and one of the things I love about North Carolina is if you go to what we call barbecue joints, you can get a hot dog all the way. And where I come from, that's chili, onions, mustard, and coleslaw. And some people don't have good coleslaw, but if you got good coleslaw, it's just an amazing hot dog. I was like, that really, there's just this satisfaction of being there in one of those places in a not fancy town at all, and just having a hot dog, being with my family, being with friends. And those small mundane things about American life, I just don't think we value enough. And if you value things like that, you're going to be more willing to value something like a statue in your hometown. So, I think that we haven't done a very good job saying that even the small things about America are worth keeping. And if we don't do that, then why do people even think any of the big things are worth keeping?
Yeah, you mentioned Pittsburgh. It's funny because I was that person that immediately after I went to school, it was the only school I applied to was the school I went to because it was close to my parents and, got money to go there. And right after I graduated, it was immediately off to New York City. Everyone was going to Washington, D.C. And I don't know, Washington, D.C. I'm sorry if this offends anyone who's listening. I just find it kind of like this very sanitized, cultureless place in a sense. And I'm someone who really values the grittiness of a city, which New York still kind of has. But I mean, less than I think it did in the past, but it definitely still has it. And I think the appeal to these places is the search for, I think a lot of it is tethered to creating one's identity to be glamorous and something that is Instagrammable. But also there is, I think this is, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how maybe this has changed over the years when, obviously with someone like Trump, who gave kind of this voice to flyover country, right? And I mean, at least that's the perception I've heard from people from those states. And we don't have to get into the political, the granular details of that, but it is interesting how, I think there has been somewhat of an attitude change and almost this, righteous defensiveness, I think, of those places. I mean, I'll just the diner stories, right? They'll joke, the New York Times writers who go to diners in the middle of nowhere, flyover country, quote unquote, and talk to locals, about what appeals to them about this candidate or, usually Trump would be the question. And so it is interesting, especially with the hollowing out of these places. I'm thinking of West Virginia is a great example because it's a beautiful state. It's wild and wonderful, but you go there and it's it just kind of reeks of death in some places because everyone's left. And of course there's the issue of rural poverty and opioid addiction is rife there. But how would you say, do we have to glamorize these places again? You said finding beauty in the mundane, but also it's almost nice that would the progressives even bother to go to these places and destroy that local culture? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have an anecdote that I think is actually worth talking about. When I drive back home, I have to drive through, since you bring up West Virginia, I have to drive through like most of West Virginia. And it's the joke is it's West by God, Virginia. One of the towns I stop in is a town called Beckley. Beckley's 18,000 people. So it's pretty good size for West Virginia. It's not tiny. And there's an Italian restaurant there called Pasquale's. It's actually pretty good. And so I stopped there. It's over Christmas, this past Christmas of 2023. And I stopped in and I had a hotel room because I was going to drive the rest of the way to Charlotte the next day to be with my family. So I got at the bar, ordered a glass of wine, and ordered a pasta dish, or I ordered toasted ravioli too, because I was hungry. I hadn't eaten lunch, and I'm sitting there, and the guy next to me is obviously local. I mean, he's just got the voice. He's loud. He's talking to everybody. He knows everybody at the place, and so it's just a friendly place. Everybody's talking with each other. They obviously know each other some way, and now it's just kind of laughing. He's like, "Man, where are you coming from?" He's just kind of asking. I said, "I'm coming from Michigan. I'm from North Carolina." And so we got to talking, and he finds out I'm a Hillsdale College professor. And this guy is not college educated. He's not sophisticated in our use of the word. He goes, "Oh, Hillsdale, man, I love all their online classes." And so, of course, this guy launches into all the stuff he's been learning. And this is some guy at a bar in Beckley, West Virginia, is telling me about the Great Tradition and telling me about all the stuff he's learning. And it hit me then that, like, what we think in our heads is that none of these people are capable of being interested in all the highfalutin stuff we live with every day. And turns out this guy drinking, Keystone or whatever the hell that beer he was, I don't think he was drinking Keystone, right? But like whatever the type of thing he was drinking, he was not a sophisticate, but he was sitting there taking all the stuff in that we think is valuable. And so I think some of it's just realizing that the people in a place like West Virginia deserve the courtesy of us thinking that they can learn about beauty just as much as the person who lives in Park Slope does. And it hit me. I actually texted a friend who works for the college in marketing. I was just like, everything we do matters, even in a place like West Virginia. I think a lot of kids, like all three of us went to college. All three of us probably went to pretty good, decent colleges. And so our brain tells us, and our experience tells us, that only people like us can appreciate what we appreciate. And that's just not the case. And I think that it's worth thinking about, how do you talk to people like, a townie, wherever you live in, Marlo, you live in Western PA. So if you go out to one of those old, steel towns, it's hard on its luck. Like, there's someone there. I don't know how many people there, but there's someone there who's just as interested in all the stuff that we care about as we are. And so I think that hit me really hard. And because I do that, I go home and I'm like, no one's really interested in this stuff. I can't talk about anything about, and I was like, no, it turns out I can have a conversation with this complete hillbilly about a lot of stuff. And so that sort of, I don't know, it kind of jarred me into thinking, like, what else am I missing about a place like Beckley, West Virginia? Like who else am I missing in a place like Beckley? Who have I missed? Who have I not seen? And I don't know, it just made me rethink a lot. And it made me think that maybe there's a lot more to what's great about the American people than even we realize.
Very wonderfully said. And I think it kind of gets back to a sense of, I think it was Jefferson who said, with sort of fundamental questions, you can ask a plowman or a professor, and the plowman is just as apt to get it right as the professor is, because he's not busy trafficking in theories. But that sort of sense of citizenship or a certain equality among citizens that the founders recognized as, or as I guess they were taking the gamble that we were capable of self-government. And I wonder what you would say about, as someone, not totally in the Ivory Tower, but sort of in an Ivory Tower in your own sense, but also connected to some sort of specific community that's not in the academy. I guess how you think, or maybe historically, what the sort of moves were from a sort of shared sense of civic respect for your fellow man towards the sort of, I guess, animosity or contempt that we see today, or that you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think a big culprit in my mind is the nationalized educational apparatus. We've imprinted all this stuff from at the federal level, and universities do it too. So one of the things, I don't want to bag on George W. Bush too much, but one of the things that really happened during the George W. Bush presidency was sort of a reflexive tendency to, even amongst so-called kind of conservatives, to say, oh, well, DC can fix this because we have a compassionate conservative in the office. And you think about something like No Child Left Behind, just an atrociously bad idea on its face. Because guess what? There's a lot of people in working class communities, and I think in minority majority working class communities, who can do a hell of a lot better job teaching their kids without somebody, even a Republican federal bureaucrat in DC, telling them what to do. Why? Because you probably are going to have different ways of learning in inner city Detroit than you are in suburban Tampa or something like that. And you need to appreciate those differences. And I think sort of get people's sort of national muddling out of it. Because what it does is basically it says we have this kind of national sociological kind of bourgeois, upper middle class, Acela Karen, who has to dominate every single aspect of education across the country. It's sort of like we want a 58-year-old Long Island woman telling everybody how to live. And I think that's what the schools, universities have done. And it's been completely unhelpful. And what it's also done is not let local communities respond very well to their own economic downturns. And that in itself has actually hurt the ability of them to value education. I think West Virginia is a good example. I think the president of the University of West Virginia kind of cleaned out the humanities. And basically the reasoning offered is, well, people in West Virginia, they don't really need this stuff. Well, why don't they really need this stuff? And it's almost, you can just hear the condescension. It's like, well, no one here is really going to go learn languages, right? And so it's like, I don't know. I sat by some guy who drives a truck for a living, and he was telling me about, the ins and outs of biblical criticism because he watched a video from the college I worked at. Maybe they do want to learn languages. And so I think, that kind of nationalization of education is a big culprit in my mind, and that's a bugbear of mine. So I admit I'm venting my spleen about that. So
that piece that you're referencing, I highly recommend any listeners take a look at it. It was in the Atlantic, and it's just a really, really sad story about, like Miles said, the gutting of West Virginia University, especially the languages program and some of these other humanities. And it is really sad to, hear that, like, for a lot of, especially native West Virginians, that was their gateway out of, in many cases, like broken homes, backgrounds where maybe their parents weren't, they weren't in higher education, and, they don't have a degree. So, not that we should solely view education as that outlet, but the utility of, I think the way that they're viewing it, especially this is an ostensibly conservative leadership at WVU who's viewing it this way, puts into perspective just how valuable schools like Hillsdale and ISI, if I may say so myself, are to a lot of students. I guess my next question is, we talk a lot about, and obviously critical race theory has been a buzzword for a few years now, and it obviously relates or even is like a feeder program into a lot of these efforts to tear down statues of people ranging from William Penn to Robert E. Lee. And as a historian, especially at a school like Hillsdale, have you seen, like, what's your perspective on that sort of integrating that sort of, cultural, what's the word for it? Something starts with an R. I'm blanking right now, but they're obviously trying to rehash history in a different way. The 1619 Project is an example of that. Do you see that in a lot of these different, community, whether it's like a school board or something like that, or the people that are behind the toppling of these statues? What's the connection there? And as a historian, what's your take on how this is affecting education? Because it is public schools that are largely adopting this. Some of the largest public schools in the country, like the LA public school system is the largest public school in the country. And you see this throughout the public school system. But it's also private schools as well. So obviously Hillsdale has been like one of the few enclaves shielded from that. But what are the effects that you're seeing as a historian, but also as a teacher at a school that seems to have a lot of influence, not just on its campus, but like the man that you ran into in Beckley, West Virginia, who is taking online courses?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate that most of my students come from relatively conservative, or if not conservative, then I'd say sort of centrist backgrounds where they just want to get a good education without a lot of ideological dump. And so I'm very fortunate in that sense. I think probably because I don't want to make it about politics, but I think politics are kind of inescapable on this. Cities, the relatively total ideological capture of city governments by sort of the most extreme left kind of excesses you can find, I think means that anybody who works and lives in those places increasingly, not everywhere, but in certain geographies, is completely committed to intellectual iconoclasm. If it's old, we tear it down, because if it's old, it must be racist, and it must be, fill in the blank of whatever sort of, critical race theory or DEI kind of term you want to use. It has to go. And I think that's particularly pronounced on the West Coast, much more so even in the American Northeast. I think that New York City on the ground is a relatively conservative place. The Bronx is a relatively conservative place on the ground. Portland, Oregon isn't. Seattle, Washington isn't. Most of California isn't. And so I think that what you see is that there's certain geographies, and I think the West Coast is the most extreme example of it, that are so committed to intellectual iconoclasm, because intellectual iconoclasm is how you get worth in those places. And there's you can almost view it, I think, as anti-colonialism. It's an internal American anti-colonialism, and it's supported by people in the academy. Not everybody in the academy, by the way. Even a lot of just progressives think this stuff is crazy. But it just seems to be a sort of anti-colonial ideology, because people don't actually have any appreciation for the relative prosperity of a place like the United States. So if you're in an urban district, you do live in poverty. I don't think conservatives should sort of blink by admitting that there's real poverty in the United States, and there's real people who are really left behind. I think the problem is that the conservative response is to sort of say, well, they can't be talked to, which maybe they can, maybe they can't. I don't think that's a great response. The progressive side is to say that those people are actually out to get you. And so America, in the minds of so many of these people, is actively out to get them. And they functionally can't believe that actually, nope, no one's out to get you. You're poor, but no one's out to get you. And so you've got, and this is happening on the right a little bit too. I think you see an extreme example of this on the right. And so I think some of it's just kind of people tapping out of, not of media per se, but sort of just actually sort of taking themselves back to the most basic local relationships they have and say, okay, is the school board actively helping me out, or are they ideologues? And it's just, I think it's questions like that. How do you get people to ask those? That's a harder question.
Marla just had to go and get someone was at her door. So I'll ask the last question. And we are coming to the end of our time. So this will be our last question. But what you just said, really, I think if it's a sort of anti-colonial movement, then what you have is it knows no limitations. Like if you sort of hate America, or you think America is systemically racist, that's a bad thing, and that's a bad place. So that does sort of know no bounds. So I guess my last question is a strategic one, which is like, how far should we push back? And I think probably a little bit of this is like, you can't really answer this question without, I guess, getting into the specifics of the person. Like, I think it's very hard to like make the case for statues in general. You kind of have to make a case for, protecting the Robert E. Lee statue or protecting the William Penn statue or whoever. Like, I don't know what the case would be for keeping up an Alexander Stevens statue. But like, I feel very comfortable making a case for like Robert E. Lee, even Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was in the original KKK. There are redeeming qualities in these people, and just the idea that someone's fallen or they've done something very bad, or have some sort of moral failing, I don't think is enough to tear down a statue or to sever the memory or the myths of a certain place. But I wonder, from your perspective, like, I guess, should we let like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stevens, I guess it's just as, large Confederate leaders go, and then once they come for, Washington and Hamilton and Jefferson, which they're already maybe starting to do, that's when we push back? Or is it something more like, it's kind of going to be like, just stop, you can't have these statues, this is our country, this is our history, and you have to, how much give and take do we as conservatives or people who are interested in conserving the American history and all of its sort of warts, virtues, vices, what do you think strategically?
So it's a great question. I was texting friends who work on Capitol Hill, and I was, as we were talking, and sort of the question was, okay, well, what do you do? And we were talking about the William Penn statue, and I think that I don't think it's a question of who, even with the statues. I think it's a question of government. The way this will stop is, and I think Ron DeSantis is maybe a figure who's figured this out a little bit, is red state governors being willing to manhandle blue cities in their own states. Because the thing about it, it's just a question of government, right? Do blue cities get to opt out of state laws just because they're a city, right? And so what you really need is governors. It's going to be state governors. And basically, it's going to be a governor saying, you are not the state government. You are a municipal government in my state. I have constitutional authority to enact the laws of my state. Because, for example, right, with the ideological capture of cities, they usually, even in a place like Florida, they can't outvote everybody. And so a single municipal government does not get to control the laws of the state of Florida. Same way in any of the other, states with big cities in it. And so it will just take a governor saying, sorry, the state house has made this law. We do not care if the city of Tampa is mad about it. You do not get to secede from the state every time you don't like a law. A statue's staying up. And it's just, it would take raw political will. And I think this is where conservatives, it's like, well, we don't want to force anybody to do anything they don't want to. Why the hell not? It happens the other way around all the time. And so it's sort, and that's not anti-constitutionalism. That's not anti-democracy, right? If 53% of Florida vote for something and Orlando doesn't want it, it doesn't mean that Orlando can't, gets to opt out of being governed. And so I think that's kind of where I came down. It's just going to take some red state governors manhandling some blue cities. That's my very unsophisticated answer for you, Tom. I'm sorry. So
No, it's good. And it makes sense. Well, Miles, thanks so much for your time and for coming on our podcast. If people want to follow more of your work, if they can't be an honors student, but people want to hear more of what you're saying and what you're writing, where should they look? What do you recommend?
Well, I have a book coming out, actually 2 books coming out this year, and I generally post the links on my Twitter feed. I'm at Ivy Miles on X, now. And so, yeah, I write a lot of semi-popular stuff and popular stuff too. So I try to keep busy. And but anyway, yeah, that's probably where the best place to look is. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Miles, and thank you to the listener for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to go over to our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.